Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Administrative and Regulatory Committee. Today is May 20th of 2024 at 4 p.m., and we will be meeting to discuss primarily waitlist process recommendations. However, our first item on the agenda is to approve minutes from our last meeting, which was held on April 15th, Tax Day of 2024. Is there a motion to approve the minutes of April 15th, 2024?
So moved.
Second.
Thank you. There's a motion and a second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Thank you. The minutes are approved. Okay, today we have a big and important topic to discuss relative to the waiting list. And I would like to introduce our President, Chelsea Andrews, to give us an introduction to the topic.
Yes, thank you. Commissioners, as we all are aware, our wait list is one of the most important tasks that we have in terms of ensuring that our residents are housed, or that the residents of this county have an opportunity to have access to affordable housing. We have quite a lot of, a varied list of various opportunities for housing in our programs, everything from scattered sites to LIHTC properties, and these are all various acronyms that can become difficult to follow, as well as the voucher program that we manage. They all have different requirements, income requirements, different preferences. We today will provide an overview of our waiting list, how we manage the waiting list, as well as share insights from the results of a consultant looking at our wait list to provide recommendations on how we can streamline and be more effective. One point of clarification I want to put forward up front is that some of the recommendations are more process-based. For example, what you click on when you see the site. And other recommendations are policy related. It is the policy related recommendations, of course, that the board ultimately votes on. Although all of these recommendations are before the committee for discussion, will be before our RAB and other stakeholders as we think through how best to ensure we have a viable and easily operational waiting list. I am going to turn it over to our Vice President of Compliance, Ms. Darcel Cox, to walk us through today's presentation.
Good afternoon. For the record, I am Darcel Cox, Vice President of Compliance. Staff has embarked on a major waitlist initiative. Today, I will provide the committee with updates on this effort. As you are aware, HOC engaged Due & Associates, and for the purposes of this meeting, shall be referred to as Due, to perform a full assessment of our waitlist practices and policies. Due is a woman minority-owned business formed in 1996. The associates of Due & Associates have collectively over 30 years experience in the housing sector. In addition to waitlist management, Due has reviewed the entire admin plan and provided recommendations, which will come to the committees, ARC and RAB, and later to the full commission. Due is also providing guidance on HOTMA, tenant selection plans, and affirmative fair housing marketing plans. Next slide. The primary reason for engagement was to solicit recommendations on waitlist policies and best practices. We have two main objectives: to increase overall efficiency and maximize affordable housing opportunities in Montgomery County. Today, we come to you with a progress update to solicit feedback on policy recommendations. Next slide. In 2015, HOC developed an electronic waitlist and implemented a single waitlist to use for all program types, including housing choice voucher and project-based vouchers. Because of the difficulty surrounding selecting applicants from one list for various programs, In 2020, HOC created multiple wait lists and added all existing applicants to each new wait list. Next slide. Housing Path has two waitlist types, housing programs and site-based. For all waitlist types, applicants are selected based on preferences, then date timestamp. Next slide. I would like to clarify HOC's waitlist preferences. The only local preferences associated with the general housing choice voucher, housing choice and voucher, project-based vouchers is the live work in Montgomery County and displacement preferences. The elderly preferences could be associated with project-based vouchers, project-based rental assistance, or low-income housing tax credits. HOC has several subgroup vouchers that are set aside for specific demographics. As an example, disability and homelessness is associated with the mainstream vouchers. And VAWA is a preference for the rent supplement program as outlined in the MOU. HOC has to select applicants that meet the required criteria. If needed, we can provide you with details for all voucher subgroupings and its criteria. Next slide. I will not spend a lot of time on the next few slides as they outline details pertaining to how staff selects applicants for various program types. Next slide. The rent restricted programs are not based on a percentage of the applicant's income. Rather, the rents are capped. Programs that are under this umbrella include tax credit, home, housing initiative fund, also known as HIF. That's just to name a few. Next slide. Project-based rental assistance is handled similarly to project-based vouchers. Subsidy is tied to the unit, and selections are based on preferences and date timestamp. Next slide. Current waitlist statistics. The applicant total in Housing Path is 39,225 applicants with an average wait time of 6.5 years for a housing choice voucher. As you can see, the applicant totals for each program specific waitlist is outlined as well. Next slide. Also outlined are applicant totals for each site-based waitlist. At the start of this presentation, I mentioned when HOC transitioned from one waitlist to several, we added each applicant to each newly created waitlist. There are currently 18,984 duplicate applicants throughout Housing Path. This causes high conversion selection to lease up rates. Staff has to pull 100 applicants to obtain one lease. Next slide. Next slide. Now we move into Dew and Associates recommendations. As President Chelsea alluded to, although we are only soliciting feedback for policy recommendations for transparency and your information, I have included the process recommendations as well. The consultant is strongly opposed to a singular waitlist and recommends that each property have its own waitlist. The scattered sites waitlist would be separated based on 5 regions. Next slide. Outlined here are process recommendations. Applicants should review one list at a time, including a detailed description, and only be allowed to select the waiting list for which they qualify. Next slide. The consultant recommends that HOC create site-based waitlists for properties for project-based voucher units. This is the one recommendation where HOC does not agree. If HOC or the management agent does not renew a contract, HOC will be left with a waitlist that is no longer applicable. Next slide. Next, we have outlined additional process recommendations, which I will not go into detail with, but this is shared for informational purposes. Next slide. HOC plans to migrate to a different waitlist platform. During this process, HOC will close its waitlist. Post-conversion, the consultant recommends closing the site-based waitlist when there are pools sufficient for a 24-month period. Next slide. Current challenges. I previously mentioned that we have over 18,000 duplications. This creates leasing challenges. Multiple HOC and third-party management agents are pulling from the same program-specific waitlist. Since the waitlists are not site-specific, the customer remains on the waitlist in the same order in the event that another property has vacant units. However, this results in the applicant pulling to the top of the waitlist potentially for the same property they rejected. As an example, I select Elliott Rule for property A, but he is not interested and is eligible to remain on the wait list for property B. However, I'm still pulling applicants from property A. Elliott remains in my selection pool. This causes a lot of over duplication. Also, Yardi, which is HOC's main system of record, does not allow housing path integration. This also creates duplications with system notes. Staff has to update both housing path and Yardi. This also does not allow for us to cross-reference who has already been housed and who remains on the existing wait list.
One moment, it looks like also our slides haven't caught up with your presentation. So next slide, please. Tim.
Think next slide.
Thank you.
Okay. So in summary, staff seeks the committee's input on waitlist structure and policies for opening and closing the waitlist. Next slide. Staff seeks input on policies for removing applicants. When applicants are housed, they will be removed from all site-based waitlists. Customers will be eligible to remain on the housing choice voucher list. Next slide. With the exception of the project-based voucher, site-based recommendation, staff agrees with all other recommendations and is seeking feedback from the Administrative and Regulatory Committee on HOC's waitlist practices. Policies. By maintaining the multiple waitlist structure, adding others, and making them all site-specific, I'm confident that overall efficiency will improve, resulting in faster lease-up rates. This will also reduce the time that staff spends on waitlist activities, thus freeing up time to focus on customer needs and retention. Next slide. Before we move into questions, I would like to walk through a timeline outlining sensitive HUD deadlines. Staff's focus will need to shift to plan for the upcoming Inspire and HOTMA implementation. Inspire must be implemented by October 1st, 2024, and HOTMA needs to be implemented January 1st, 2025. The waitlist migration will be a huge undertaking to include cross-collaboration with staff. It will require a significant amount of time, staff's time, training, and communication to relevant stakeholders. Therefore, although the date has not yet been established, staff has elected to start the process after full implementation of the HUD-required Inspire and HOTMA updates. However, we will start the discussion in alignment with the HOTMA updates this coming fall. Next slide. This concludes my presentation. I will take any questions and comments at this time.
Thank you, Darcel. I'd just like to start by reminding the commissioners that you can comment on any aspect of anything about HOC, just like you can speak to any employee or any resident in HOC and see any document in HOC as part of our oversight responsibilities. So I don't want to limit you to that. What's special about policy is that only commissioners can set policy. So that's where staff needs us to speak in most, but you need not limit your comments to that. With that, are there any comments, questions?
I have a question, Commissioner. I just, I may have didn't hear it, but how many people are on the wait list, Ms. Cox? How many people are on the wait list now?
Currently, there are 39,225.
Right, that's what I had wrote down. I thought I had wrote a wrong number down. And would you agree that some of these are duplicates because several people have applied for different places?
Yes, we have over 18,000 duplicates. duplicate applicants. Over 18,000 on the current wait list overall.
So it wouldn't be 39 if we would collaborate and get those double, because what I'm asking is it that some of them already have a place and yet they're still on the waiting list? That's what I'm asking.
We're unsure of who is housed and still on the wait list. We could easily do a cross check with who maybe has a voucher.
Mhm.
But there are several applicants. I wouldn't even back out the 18,000 because they could be on multiple wait lists. So we would have to take a deeper dive to see exactly what the true number is.
Okay.
However, I would like to just weigh in. There's a policy consideration. Currently, if you are housed in certain programs, you still remain on the waiting list, which means you would still get another call when another unit becomes available. There's a recommendation before the commission and before you all for discussion in regards to once you are housed, should you be eliminated from the waiting list. And the only exception that we cannot make any adjustment to is the federal requirement that you maintain the ability to always be on the voucher waiting list. That's the only exception. But if you're in a PBRA unit, if you're in a LIHTC unit, another affordable unit, and the commission agrees that that means you are housed, that would be a policy recommendation that we could advance in an updated administrative plan and updated policies that would ultimately remove those individuals.
And President Andrews, what is the purpose of keeping them on the wait list if they are housed? Is it just to give them preference if something else became available? Because I mean, I agree with that change, but
I must admit that I'm not certain what the rationale was many years ago when that decision was made by the commission. But as it stands, in order to really move through the waiting list, our recommendation coincides with the recommendation of the consultant, which is if you are housed, you should not be eligible for another offer for another unit.
yeah, in which I agree. I just don't understand that. When I was reading it, I'm like, well, you have housing. So at that point, yeah, you should be removed and, kind of allow another person an opportunity on the wait list. Another question I had, I was researching and just looking at other larger housing authorities than we are. I know that other commissioners feel strongly about keeping the wait list open continuously, but these other housing authorities do close theirs. New York, for example, has been closed for 10 years and won't open it until this June. Philadelphia, 4 years they've been closed. So, I just don't understand the purpose of the continuous house, the wait list being open, other than, of course, the ones that we are required to, keep them on the wait list. But it just seems to me in hearing the presentation, reading it, that we have a lot of data cleanup that we should do to the wait list. So I don't understand why maybe we wouldn't consider just closing it until you guys are at that point where you can truly migrate it successfully and work on cleaning up some of the duplicates. But to keep it open when you know that we don't have the opportunity to really provide housing just doesn't make sense to me. It's almost like a college course. You get in the wait list, but if the slots are taken, then you can't get in. So, but yes, I do agree with the admin change to remove someone that has been housed.
And to that point, staff does agree with the recommendation from the consultant to, at a bare minimum, close during the cleanup phase of this effort. That will take some time, and to make sure that people understand that people who are on the list are on the list, but that we need to close for cleanup purposes. And then there really is a policy discussion for the commission on, once we have completed that effort, whether the list should remain open or closed. I can share the counter argument in regards to keeping it open, and we are the anomaly. The counter argument is that if you don't keep the list open, then you never have a true sense of what the county need is. And that when you maintain an open list, then you are able to easily quantify how many people are in need of additional housing in this county, especially if there's an eligibility or a preliminary eligibility kind of assessment that takes place. And I know that many of our counterpartners and key stakeholders find that data to be helpful when advocating for additional resources, federal, state, others. And so being able to say, we know that the true need is fill in the blank, is one of the rationales that has been advanced for maintaining the list in an
Right.
open status.
Right.
I would
I
add a
understand
comment.
that if the data was really clean. I mean, but we're talking about people on there who has been housed. We're talking about duplicates. So you're presenting a number, and I understand the politics of it, but at the same time, if you're giving faulty data, does that really make sense to the counter argument? So, I understand the political part and being able to get that information, but I feel that internally, if you have a good system, uh, you can provide that data without keeping this list open that really is not accurate. So that, I understand both sides, but it's not true. So just finding a better way to present the information for, understanding the housing needs without you creating a burden on the staff to maintain both customer service to people who are housed and maintain a waiting list, especially when, hearing some of the concerns from our union representatives may be true or not, but just the burden of staff right now. And, people are really overworked. So to add that increased burden, I think it is time that we really take a look at the wait list and make some policy that makes sense. So thank you.
I totally agree, Commissioner Byrd, that
Yeah.
there is a huge need to clean the data up, and that we need to support staff in whatever it would take to do that. There's an additional reason, once that it's cleaned up, to keep the waiting list open, and that is an equity issue. In the example of New York that had their waiting list closed for 10 years, anybody that moved to New York during those 10 years, or whose economic situation changed dramatically such that they needed some support to be able to afford housing, had no way to even request that or to make their need known. And that, I think, you can literally have people living in a city for a number of years and never have the opportunity to make their need known on a waiting list if the waiting lists are kept closed for such long periods of time. So there's an equity issue there in terms of favoring people who have been there longer, et cetera.
Mhm.
I mean, but I don't understand equity. If I don't have the unit available, then what is the point in having a wait list? That was also part of New York. I mean, they only have a set number of units. So part of you kicking people out, same in Baltimore, Philly, same with us. So we can't kick them out if they are paying or abiding by the rules. So again, it creates also a false hope. So yeah, I can move to a city, but if the housing unit is not available there is no equity because now the person that's housed, I mean, they could feel the same way. They've been living there. So again, I just don't understand the continuous opening of it until, we have, again, I'm all about data and trying to track and report things accurately. So as we see our housing availability change and we can reasonably house people from the waiting list, look at ways that maybe we can reopen it for a certain time, but just to keep it open and have people apply when you know that you don't have the availability, I don't see where that is creating equity, but it is giving a false hope that I'm going to get something when I'm not. So,
Thank you.
Well, my, go ahead.
I could just say one thing, Linda, and then turn it over to you
No, go
again.
ahead.
I do think we need to separate closing it while we clean the data versus afterwards. I think those are two very different
oh yeah, for
issues.
sure. We said that.
And
Yeah.
I certainly support being able to go down while the data is being cleaned. And I'll have some questions about that in a minute, but Linda, feel free to go ahead.
The person that we're working with their name is Dewey. Am I right, Darcel? Dewey Associates?
Do and Associates.
Dewey and Associates, okay. And so they're the ones that are helping us try to get our waiting list back together, right?
Well, they reviewed, they took a look at our wait list and they provided recommendations for us.
Recommendations, okay. So what category do we go under if a person expires? That's an opening there for a resident to get a place. If a person expires, or if a person leaves the place voluntarily or take their voucher somewhere else to another city or another state, what category does that come under?
I'm sorry, I don't understand.
When an individual has a voucher, you're asking how do we reflect when they port out? The term is port out when they go to another state.
Well, if they go to another state, then they're not, we are not, even though we gave them that voucher, we don't have anything else to do with that. They go to another housing association. What I'm asking is, have you put that in with people that have expired or people that have taken their voucher and went to another state? Is this, all this data that you have here, is that in it too?
No, I guess I understand your question in terms of our ability to look at the individuals on the list and do a data bump to know if they've been housed in other jurisdictions or in other programs outside of our state. The answer is no, we don't have that data at this time. However, when we do go through and reach out to every participant or every individual on the list, there is an analysis that takes place to determine eligibility. At that time, we would learn that they have a voucher potentially if they respond, but we don't have, there's not a universal system across that gives us that data on an ongoing basis that would clean our data up if they've received a voucher in another jurisdiction.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like to ask some questions related to cleanup. If my memory serves me, and it's certainly not perfect, we at the point in time when we switched from a single waiting list to these multiple waiting lists, paid to have a tool developed that could take people out of multiple waiting lists after they had received housing. Does that tool exist?
I'm not familiar with the tool, but I know that we have something in place that identifies duplicates, but not necessarily if they've already been housed, because we're not able to integrate with Yardi. And in order to use that tool, we would have to integrate with Yardi.
I see, but it does identify where the same name is showing up on multiple lists.
Correct.
Okay. So that at least is a good start towards cleaning it up. Then you just have to run it against your resident and voucher lists to see if they already have housing, to figure out whether they need to be deleted from all those lists. Okay, I had thought the automated tool went to the next step and cleaned it out, but I can see if that's not the case, how this has accumulated into the situation that it is. Okay. Let me see. It's hard to know where to start. There are so many issues here and so many ways to enter the program, the policy decisions. At the risk of sounding like an academic nerd, since I did do my PhD in ethics and society and have studied distributive justice more than any of you would ever want to think about or consider, I would like to lay out some basic principles from distributive justice and how I see that they would apply to this situation. To come up with a sort of short description of what fairness is considered to be in distributive justice, it's having a system where if you had no idea who you were in that situation, you would design the system so that you had the maximal choice of ending up appropriately dealt with and getting the resources that you needed. And it's sometimes, well, I won't go into that, but that's kind of the underlying theory, that it needs to be designed to equalize opportunity so that no matter who you are in the system, your opportunity is maximized. And with that as a background, I wrote down 6 principles of fairness that I would expect to see in policies as we go forward. One is those who live or work in Montgomery County should get preference, and that is because we are, after all, Montgomery County's housing authority. We have that now, and so that's great, and I think that we need to make sure we continue that. Beyond that, all of the other things that were listed, and I think you clarified this when you spoke, Darcel, are really specialized vouchers or specialized programs where it's not that we have a preference for people, but that program or voucher has specific criteria that those people must meet in order to attain the support. So I would recommend that beyond live and work in Montgomery County, we have no other preferences applied to the vouchers or waiting lists, but that we do collect the criteria information that we would need to match people against those particular programs so that we can do so appropriately. I think it's reasonable to allow people to have some kind of geographic preference because of wanting to be near a work or other relatives or places within Montgomery County. The presentation had zones listed, 5 zones. I'm not sure if those zones comprehensively cover all of the area of Montgomery County that has housing in it, or all of the area where we have our housing. If not, I would suggest that we have those expanded to be inclusive and make those the basis for waiting lists beyond the vouchers. The voucher program has to have its own waiting list. I understand that because of the regulations that apply to it that are different. That would narrow the number of waiting lists. Quite frankly, to me, adding more waiting lists just creates the opportunity for more chaos in the system and more duplication. I don't see how adding waiting lists can solve the problem that we have evolved to from going from one waiting list to many. Those on the waiting lists who do not, or have any HOC housing support should always get preference over anyone who already has HOC housing support, be it a voucher or a specific unit that they have been assigned. And I think Commissioner Byrd was leaning in that same direction, that the idea of giving people who already have some form of subsidized or affordable housing the first chance above people who don't have it is problematic. If we need to keep them on the voucher list, we could do that, but everyone who doesn't have support should get priority over anyone that already has support. The waiting lists should be chosen to match specific criteria of a housing voucher or whatever subsidy we have that's become available within the particular geographic zone. And that is how we could find the people who appropriately can take advantage of that and then use the time on the waiting list as the criteria for ranking all of the people who have the appropriate characteristics for that program. I would then say that anyone who turns down an opportunity from the waiting list should definitely be taken off of all other waiting lists except the voucher one. That with tens of thousands of people waiting for affordable housing, to give anyone multiple chances or multiple bites at the apple, so to speak, while others are getting nothing, I think fails the basic principles of fairness and equity. So I would like to recommend that those principles be considered in designing the policies that we come up with. And I will stop there and see if either of my colleagues have questions about that or staff have questions about that.
I just have one question to ask, Darcel. Darcel, how many chances do they get while they're on the waiting list? How many chances do they get to turn down a place?
So for housing choice voucher, they receive 1 turn down, or project-based voucher, they receive 2 turn downs, and for all other programs, they receive 2 turn downs.
2?
Yes.
Okay. So it'll be 2. That's 1. Okay.
Darcel, is it possible you can, oh, I'm sorry, Commissioner Krim, did you have another question?
No, go.
Okay. Do you mind going back to the recommendation that you said HOC did not agree with from the consultant, or if you preferred, we can table it and discuss that later if it's more appropriate?
Okay, so the recommendation was recommend multiple site-based lists for efficiency. If not implemented for each property with PBVs, should create a separate elderly versus non-elderly wait list. So in my notes, the consultant recommends that HOC create a site-based wait list for properties with project-based vouchers. And we are HOCs opposed to this because if a management company or if HOC decides not to renew the contract, we will have a wait list for a specific property that no longer has project-based voucher units.
And just to remind commissioners on how we currently operate with project-based vouchers. So there are various developments across the county where we have contracts with them to provide a certain amount of project-based vouchers. Those contracts are renewed at different different stages or different number of years, depending on that specific contract. Our concern is if we created a waiting list just for that property and we don't renew that contract, you now have all of these people who are waiting for that property that no longer have preference or priority for that site. So that was the rationale for the position that staff advanced.
Okay, thank you.
But if you used the zone system and everyone selected 2 zones of areas that they wanted to live in, as those things changed, you could just pull people up and say, we have one over here at this address instead of telling them that you have one at the first address, right? So you would not have that problem because it was not property specific as a waiting list.
Potentially, I think that we have looked at the zone concept, and we do agree that zones do cover, I believe, all of the areas where we have properties. We are still doing some analysis on how the zoning would work, and this is really a great place to get feedback from resident advisory board, focus group sessions where people would have to make these kind of decisions to see if that would be one of the ways they would want to identify housing and or their selections. But this is definitely an area of further exploration.
Well, once we set a policy of how the wait lists will work, then they would need to have the focus groups within that policy parameter. So we could see about that. I do think that the one thing I am very pleased to see that there is seemingly universal interest in increasing the amount of information that people have at the time that they sign up about what their eligibility is for and what particular units would their criteria match, et cetera. I would like to encourage that we do everything possible to assist people in an initial sign up and or if we re-sign up everybody at recertification for this transition to Yardi. I think it's a great opportunity to deploy the volunteer corps that you had mentioned in the strategic plan to train people to help our applicants with what the criteria is for various things. The one thing about the zones that I would have concern about, we have higher concentrations of housing that we own in some of those zones than others. And I would think at a minimum, we would want to make that information available to people so that if they wanted to maximize their opportunity to be selected for a unit that comes open, they could choose, say, the 2 zones that have the highest number of units that we own in it and avoid zones that have very few units that we own. With our vigorous timeline and pipeline for building new and for acquiring already existing affordable housing, we would have to think about, does it make sense to also tell them what we know would be coming online within those areas as well, and at what time frame in terms of moving to a zone process. But even if you let people sign up for all 5 zones and or HCV vouchers, it's still an easier to manage, fewer different waiting lists than if you have the current system or property-based waiting lists. It would at least reduce it to no more than 6 instead of, we have what, 22 now, I believe. So that would be a 70% reduction in the number of waiting lists that you had to manage and be keeping clean.
And just as a reminder, the consultant's recommendation was to create even more waiting lists than we currently have, primarily because and of course there's various ways to consider the approach, but if the goal is to make sure that you're only contacting individuals who are eligible for that program, then having program-based or site-based waiting lists allows you an opportunity to ensure that with every call, that individual met that preliminary requirement and expressed interest in that particular site. The larger the group, the more the chances that you're calling people who may or may not be eligible and may or may not be interested, even though it might be in that same region, in that particular site. And what our experience has been is it's an extremely onerous task to go down the list when individuals are like, I wasn't interested in that one. I'd rather live in this one. Or to call someone and find out they're not actually eligible. And if they had known, and they stay on the list as it stands, but it's just a lot of reach out happens where we're not able to get the response we need. And then there's a time sensitivity around lease up that ultimately is impacted by the effort.
Right. I
So,
think
right.
I agree that lease up process needs to be monitored carefully with metrics so that we can get performance on that for both HOC and property managers. My assumption and recommendation here is that you have at the time of either initial sign up or recertification all of the criteria noted in the application and known, and that you have an automated way to search for only those who meet that application or those criteria, so that you would not end up with a bunch of people who don't qualify. And quite frankly, if they don't like the place or don't want that, then they can go to the bottom of the list and sign up again from the bottom
And
of the
you would
list.
have them have of course, I think the further discussion, of course, with everyone will also, and this is an area where having feedback from individuals who fill out, or would be the individuals that fill out a form, would be informative, or apply for a waiting list would be informative. But based on your recommendation, they would only have the ability to choose to live in 2 different areas in the county, 2 different zones.
That would be my recommendation, but even if you went to allowing them to choose all 5, that's still fewer wait lists to manage than by 70% fewer than what we have now to manage.
But then that actually goes back to almost where we started, which was if everyone selects all 5. So this is, and it's a nuanced point again, but that is where we started, where we put everyone on every wait list.
There's a difference though. At the time we did that, apparently we did not work with each individual to explain what they qualified for, what there was, and collect the criteria that we need to make selections that will bring us a list of only those who are qualified by the criteria. I think that was the big miss on our part, I'll say, in not understanding or recognizing at the time that we switched to the multi-list, that we needed to put staff time, serious staff time, into assisting the reauthorization over the next year for all of the people on the waiting list to make it meaningful and narrow it down. I know when we had those discussions, we talked about the fact that we needed a way to weed out people who didn't qualify for various things. What I'm describing is all of that information would be available on the application up front, so that you would have a tool, and that you would have a tool that could select based on the proper criteria. I think the big policy issue here that I'm bringing up is that with tens of thousands of people looking for an extraordinarily scarce resource, you don't give people 2 or 3 options. You give them one chance. You provide them with affordable housing or subsidy that meets their needs based on the criteria and the program's criteria. And that's it. If they don't want that, they can go back and put in a new application that's date stamped with the new date for anything that they want.
Mm. That that's not getting them off the waiting list though, Fran. You know, because people they like more than two choices. They like the five that they got to go to wherever they wanted to go. That's not helping on the waiting list.
Well, I
I
think we
thought
would
we're
all like
trying to,
that.
hmm?
I think we would all like to have lots of choices all the time, but when you're allocating or distributing an extremely scarce resource, which is what we have been given the responsibility for doing here, that you are hurting people further down the waiting list to keep letting people pop up at the top who have already turned down options of reasonable housing.
Oh, I agree with that part.
So I think that's an important change that we should make in terms of policy, is to eliminate the multiple turns that people get. Do you have any other thoughts, Pamela?
And I'm just interested in what is it that we need to move forward? Because I really believe and would want the other commissioners involved in further discussion regarding policy, as well as more education on the wait list itself and how it operates, similar to what we got today. So I know the staff is extremely busy and will be busy with what you discussed today. And those other items to me are more important because they are time sensitive. So we could talk all day on this, but I would like to really engage the other commissioners and make sure that they have the proper education on what we can and cannot do regarding the wait list. But what is it that we need to provide to you today, Darcel, to move forward? I forgot what you wanted today. I read it earlier. So can we move to that recommendation for you?
I will just say that the goal here today, because there are no decisions being advanced to the
Okay,
full
great.
commission, was really deliberatory for us to have
Okay.
an opportunity to share the feedback that we've received from the consultant, to hear your thoughts. We're hearing some trends in terms of some of the policy considerations.
Mhm.
For example, there seems to be alignment that at a bare minimum, we should, when we begin this effort, close for a period of time to address what needs to happen in terms of a cleanup. Then there is a policy decision that needs to happen amongst the
Mhm.
commission on should we remain open or closed in the future. There seems to be some level of consensus around once you're housed, not receiving multiple offers other than the voucher option, that we must remain available. And so those themes are pretty clear. There are then the other questions around how we configure the list, how people interact and have access to various options, and we can continue that discussion. We are presenting this at a time that also coincides with what most housers or across the industry are viewing as an extraordinarily difficult time for housing authorities because of how all of these HUD requirements have been placed upon us at the exact same time. And so we are preparing for Inspire and HOTMA regulatory changes, and it is an extraordinarily heavy lift on the same staff that would be handling the wait list changes. The voucher program, as well as our compliance programs, are heavily engaged in ensuring that we're complying with those requirements. It's the recommendation that we have this discussion get your feedback, have an opportunity to go back and do that deeper dive, for example, looking at zones and looking at the other questions that came up. But really, we would be coming back to this committee with something unrelated, and that's Inspire. That's the next action item that we need to present to ARC in order to meet our requirements. And so there will be an educational component there, as well as administrative plan changes that have to happen for that. And then subsequent to that time, we will be advancing recommendations, which are also policy related for HOTMA. And that's where in the fall, we would like to present an opportunity to revisit the wait list policy considerations so that when we go forward with any public notice for those HOTMA changes, we also can go forward with these recommendations if there's a readiness. And so that is how, and then we have to have a plan. It's not just updating the waiting list. We have to get and have an opportunity to, one, determine what the cost is going to be to do the proper cleanup, to budget for that. That might be a procurement exercise we need to undertake. We will have to have a full implementation plan that includes how we will communicate it out, all of the staffing needed to actually address the backlog or the waiting list in the cleanup effort, and put in parameters moving forward, how we transition. And so, and transition, the actual transition to Yardi from our current system. So there are a lot of steps that have to take place to gear us up for what will be this streamlined effort. And our proposal is to come back to the commission in the fall to have more informed next steps.
My sense from your description is that it would support you better to have decisions earlier rather than waiting to the fall, because you need to do exactly all that planning and execution that you described and communication. If there already is a tool that identifies duplicates by name, I mean, can you begin figuring that out or hiring somebody for that now? I would hesitate to wait until the fall to have further conversations with the commission, because it may take more than one conversation with the commission. This is a really important area. It literally is our reason for existence as an agency. And I would suggest that sooner is better than later. In the meantime, I would suggest that for my colleagues, sending any questions that you have or ideas that you have or thoughts that you have on this to the staff as soon as you are able to would be helpful as well, so that they have that working knowledge as they go forward. And you can get answer.
Yeah, I still want to be on record in saying that I support the staff and their recommendation, their time frame and waiting till the fall. I understand the other initiatives that are time sensitive and require and are required by HUD. So again, to overburden you with this wait list, we are doing what we are put in existence for, and that is to provide housing. So we have thousands of people already housed, and they, quite frankly, are our first responsibility. And so the staff is already working to the greatest extent and best extent that they know how. And so these other initiatives, Inspire and HOTMA, to me, take precedence right now over the wait list. So if you and staff are recommending to wait for the fall with the wait list changes and further discussion, then I support that wholeheartedly.
Thank you.
I'm looking at the other commissioners. I think this is a very sensitive. This is what we do, and I would like to have some more feedback on it from the other commissioners as well as any data that we need. As you said, President, it's a lot that has to go and play with this. This is not just one thing. And you have to get it, the Artie has to be on it. So it is a lot. It is a lot. And I do understand that. But I just want the other commissioners to get in on this as well. So we'll all be on board now. You said in the fall, this would take place in the fall. You want us to
Right.
gather in the fall?
Yes, and I'll have an opportunity to have further discussion with our general counsel on how we could potentially approach maybe work sessions or a combination of administrative sessions where there's the education component, but really have an opportunity to think about how to engage as many commissioners in this process. Yes.
Thank you. Any other comments before we adjourn? Questions or thoughts? Okay, well, thank you for what you have given us in terms of information from the consultants and these briefing materials. I learned a lot. I thought I had some sense of what was going on, and I learned it was very different than what I understood was going on, or what the last time we had an internal auditor look at it said was going on. So I do appreciate this update and the information, and look forward to whatever else you have in the future. And with that, the meeting is adjourned.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank you.
commissioners.